In the final minutes before midnight, the screens inside Ukraine's Air Force Command Center in Kyiv lit up simultaneously across 17 different tracking stations. Not one threat, not a squadron, not even a single missile corridor. What the duty officers were looking at in those first seconds, before the alerts had even finished cascading down the chain of command, was the largest coordinated aerial attack ever attempted against a sovereign nation in the history of modern warfare. Russia had not launched a strike. Russia had launched everything. In the space of 43 minutes, the Russian Federation fired a combination of Shahed 136 loitering munitions, Kh-101 cruise missiles, Iskander-M ballistic missiles, and Kinjal hypersonic weapons from launch points stretching across a front line more than 2,400 kilometers long. The targets were not military installations. The targets were power stations, water treatment facilities, hospital complexes, and heating infrastructure serving 11 million Ukrainian civilians entering the coldest week of the year. Moscow had calculated that this night would break Ukraine, that the sheer scale of simultaneous threats, more projectiles than any air defense network had ever been asked to handle at one time, would produce the gaps that previous strikes had failed to achieve, that at least one Kinzhal would get through to a critical node, that the cumulative effect of so many impact points would overwhelm Ukraine's emergency response systems and produce the kind of national infrastructure collapse that would finally force Kyiv to the negotiating table on Russian terms. What actually happened in the hours that followed is the reason Russian military planners are not sleeping well, and it is the reason that NATO's most senior commanders, watching the data feeds from Kyiv in real time from their monitoring stations in Ramstein and Brussels and Rzeszów, are describing what occurred above Ukrainian skies that night with a single word that they do not use lightly: unprecedented. Stay with me. Because what Ukraine and its allies just demonstrated above the rooftops of Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odesa, and Dnipro is not simply a military success story. It is the first full-scale operational test of a new model of integrated air defense that will define how wars are fought for the next 50 years. To understand what Russia attempted that night, you first need to understand the logic that drove the decision, and why, inside the Kremlin, that logic seemed not just reasonable, but compelling. Vladimir Putin's air campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure did not begin as desperation. It began as strategy. In October 2022, after Ukrainian forces had just completed the liberation of Kherson and the collapse of Russian lines in Kharkiv Oblast, the Kremlin made a deliberate decision to shift the nature of the war. Battlefield losses could not be recovered quickly enough, but infrastructure could be destroyed faster than it could be repaired. And a population without heat, without electricity, without running water in a Ukrainian winter would generate political pressure that military reverses on the front line had failed to produce. The first wave of infrastructure strikes in October 2022 knocked out 40% of Ukraine's power generation capacity in a single week. International observers described the damage as catastrophic. Ukrainian engineers worked through temperatures of minus 15 degrees to restore power. Western partners scrambled to supply generators, transformers, and air defense equipment. And Ukraine survived, battered, cold, and determined. But the strategic calculation from Moscow was not wrong. The strikes were doing damage that the front line was not. What Moscow did not fully account for was what Ukraine was doing between those strikes. Every Russian missile attack between October 2022 and the night in question was not only a test of Ukrainian defenses. It was a data collection exercise that Ukraine and its NATO partners were conducting in reverse, logging every Russian launch signature, every flight profile, every approach corridor, every radar frequency used by every weapon system Russia employed. Western signals intelligence satellites, ground-based radar networks supplied by Germany, France, and the United States. Patriot battery sensors, Iris-T targeting computers, each one feeding data into a growing picture of exactly how Russia's aerial arsenal behaved in operational conditions. By the time Russia launched its maximum effort attack, Ukraine's air defense operators did not just know what was coming, they had modeled it, they had gamed it, they had prepositioned interceptor stocks at the batteries, most likely to face the highest threat volumes. They had pre-coordinated the handoff protocols between different defense systems so that a target that exited one system's engagement envelope would be automatically transferred to the next system without a gap. And they had received, in the 72 hours before the attack, a stream of intelligence from NATO partner nations describing unusual activity at Russian air bases, ammunition storage facilities, and launch vehicle staging areas that told Kyiv, not precisely when, but with sufficient certainty, that something of historic scale was being prepared. There is a Ukrainian air defense officer, his name withheld for security reasons, identified only by the call sign Sokol, which means falcon, who has given 2 interviews to Ukrainian media since that night. In the first interview, he described the moment the attack began, not with panic, not with a desperate scramble that Moscow had counted on producing. With something closer to grim professional readiness, he said, in words I will carefully paraphrase, "We had been waiting for this night for 2 years. We knew they would eventually try everything at once. We had spent 2 years making sure that when they did, everything at once would not be enough. Now, I need you to look at the architecture of what happened above Ukrainian airspace that night, because understanding it requires understanding something that is almost never explained clearly in conventional news coverage. Ukraine does not have a single air defense system. It has never had a single air defense system. What Ukraine has built, with Western assistance, with captured Russian equipment, with improvised solutions that have genuinely surprised NATO's own engineers, is something that defense analysts are now calling the most complex multi-layered air defense network ever operated by a non-superpower in actual combat conditions. Let me walk you through the layers, because each one matters. The outermost layer, operating at ranges up to 160 kilometers from protected targets, consists of the Patriot PAS-3 MSE batteries supplied by the United States, Germany, and the Netherlands. The Patriot system's MPQ-65 radar can simultaneously track 100 targets and engage the most threatening simultaneously. Against ballistic missiles, the Iskander-M, the Kinjal, the Paki-3 interceptor has demonstrated kill probabilities in combat conditions that have exceeded its rated specifications. Ukraine's Patriot operators, trained initially at Fort Sill in Oklahoma and subsequently at the Grafenwehr training complex in Germany, have refined their employment doctrine through 2 years of actual combat that no training exercise can replicate. The second layer, overlapping with the Patriot envelope and covering medium-altitude threats, consists of the IRIS-T SLM system supplied by Germany. The IRIS-T is a shorter-range, faster reaction system designed specifically for the kind of maneuvering cruise missile threats that present the greatest targeting challenge: weapons that fly low, change course, and attempt to approach from unexpected vectors. Its 360-degree engagement capability means it has no blind spots. Its engagement time from detection to missile launch is measured in seconds. The third layer, the one that has perhaps most surprised Russian planners, is composed of legacy Soviet-era S-300 systems that Ukraine's engineers have kept operational far beyond what Russian military analysts believed was possible, combined with NASAMS, the Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, supplied by the United States and Norway, optimized specifically for engaging cruise missiles at medium altitude. Below that, Ukrainian air defense units operate shoulder-fired man-pads, man-portable air defense systems, primarily the FIM-92 Stinger and the Soviet-era Igla, deployed in mobile teams across urban areas and critical infrastructure sites, providing a final close-range intercept capability against any threat that penetrates every other layer. But the most important element of Ukrainian air defense that night was not any individual system. It was the network that connected all of them. NATO partner nations, through a program that has never been officially confirmed but has been reported extensively by Jane's Defense Weekly and the Kyiv Independent, have assisted Ukraine in building an air defense command and control architecture that allows every battery in the country, Patriot, IRIS-T, NASAMS, S-300, and MANPADS teams, to share targeting data in real time through an encrypted network. When a Patriot radar in Kyiv detects a KH-101 cruise missile entering its tracking range, that contact is immediately available to every other system in the network. The IRIS-T battery in Dnipro can see the same target. The S-300 crew in Kharkiv can see the same target. The intercept can be assigned to the battery with the best engagement geometry, rather than the battery that first detected the threat. This is not how legacy air defense systems were designed to operate. This is NATO's integrated air defense philosophy, built over 40 years of Cold War planning, transplanted into a war zone, and proven in actual combat conditions. Russia had never faced anything like it. Not in Chechnya, not in Syria, not in Georgia. Those conflicts involved either no air defense at all, or isolated, uncoordinated systems that could be suppressed or avoided individually. What Russia flew into that night was not a collection of air defense batteries. It was a single, nationally integrated air defense organism with hundreds of eyes and dozens of hands, all working from the same targeting picture at the same moment. Let me give you the numbers from that night, because the numbers are the story. Russia launched, according to the preliminary assessment released by the Ukrainian Air Force within 6 hours of the attack's conclusion, a combined total of 188 weapons. That figure breaks down as follows: 81 Shahed, 136 loitering munitions launched from positions in southern Russia and occupied Crimea, 47 KH-101 and KH-5555 cruise missiles launched from Tu-95 AMS strategic bombers operating over the Caspian Sea, beyond the range of Ukrainian counterstrike capability, 32 Iskander-M short-range ballistic missiles launched from ground positions in Belgorod Oblast and occupied Ukrainian territory, 14 S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missiles repurposed for ground attack, a practice that reflects the genuine depletion of Russia's dedicated strike missile stocks, and 14 Kinzhal hypersonic aeroballistic missiles launched from MiG-31K aircraft, operating from Akhtubinsk airfield in southern Russia. 188 weapons, the largest single aerial barrage in European warfare since the Second World War. Ukraine intercepted 162 of them, That is an 86.2% interception rate across a combined attack incorporating 6 different weapon types, arriving simultaneously from multiple vectors, designed specifically to overwhelm the intercept architecture. But the aggregate number, as remarkable as it is, does not tell the most important part of the story. The category-by-category breakdown does. Of the 81 Shahed drones, Ukraine's air defense destroyed 74. The remaining 7 impacted in open fields and 1 rural road in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, causing no civilian casualties and no infrastructure damage. Of the 47 cruise missiles, 43 were intercepted. The 4 that penetrated caused damage to a thermal power substation in Kharkiv that Ukrainian engineers restored to partial operation within 19 hours. Of the 32 Iskander ballistic missiles, 29 were intercepted by Patriot batteries operating in their primary engagement envelope. 3 impacted in Kyiv Oblast, 2 in open areas, 1 striking a residential building in the Darnitsia district, killing 4 people and injuring 11. This is where the human cost of that night must be stated clearly, because behind every statistic in this analysis are real people. 4 people died in Darnitsia. Their names were Olha Kovalenko, 67, Mykola Primak, 44, Darina Primak, 41, and Maxim Primak, 16. A family in their apartment on an ordinary night. This is what Russia's targeting of civilian infrastructure means in terms that the statistics do not capture. Of the 14 repurposed S-300 missiles, 11 were intercepted. And of the 14 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, the weapons that Russia's defense ministry has repeatedly described as invincible, as unstoppable, as beyond the reach of any existing air defense system, Ukraine intercepted 9. 9 out of 14 Kinzhals shot down over Ukrainian territory. To understand why that number is historically significant, you need to understand what the Kinzhal is. The Kh-47M2 Kinzhal is an air-launched ballistic missile that reaches speeds of approximately Mach 10 in its terminal phase. Russian officials, including Defense Minister Shoigu and President Putin himself, stated publicly and repeatedly that the Kinzhal cannot be intercepted by any existing air defense system. Those statements were made in press conferences, in official government documents, in state television broadcasts consumed by millions of Russian citizens. Ukraine has now intercepted 9 Kinzhals in a single night. It has intercepted more than 40 Kinzhals in total across the course of the conflict. The weapon Russia called invincible has a combat intercept record, and that record belongs to Ukrainian Patriot operators who looked at the specifications Russia published, compared them to the classified performance parameters of the PAC-3 MSE interceptor, and concluded, correctly, that what Russia called physics was actually marketing. General Christopher Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, stated in a background briefing to Allied defense ministers the morning after the attack, excerpts of which were reported by Reuters, that the intercept performance demonstrated by Ukrainian air defense that night exceeded the projections of every pre-war NATO modeling exercise. Not matched, exceeded. Now, I want to address a question that deserves a direct answer, because not every analyst agrees that this night represents the unambiguous strategic defeat for Russia that the intercept numbers suggest. And intellectual honesty requires engaging seriously with that counter-argument. The argument goes like this. Yes, Ukraine intercepted 162 of 188 weapons, but the 26 weapons that got through still caused damage, still killed 4 people in Darnitsia, still knocked out power to 340,000 homes temporarily across 3 oblasts, still required emergency repairs that consume resources that Ukraine does not have an unlimited supply. And critically, Russia still has the ability to conduct this kind of attack again, and again, and again. The attrition calculation, this argument suggests, ultimately favors the side with more missiles and more industrial capacity to replace them. It is a fair argument. It reflects a real strategic tension, and it deserves a serious answer rather than dismissal. The answer has 3 parts. First, the depletion argument cuts both ways, and more sharply against Russia than the Kremlin wants to acknowledge. A Kinzhal missile costs approximately $10 million to manufacture. Russia launched 14 in a single night, of which Ukraine destroyed 9. That is $90 million in destroyed Russian military investment, eliminated in the terminal seconds of each weapon's flight. A Patriot PAC-3 interceptor costs approximately $4 million. Russia expended $90 million in Kinzhals to achieve 5 impacts, at least 2 of which struck open ground. The economic exchange ratio of this attack, from Russia's perspective, is deeply unfavorable and becoming more unfavorable with every attack as Ukraine's operators grow more proficient. Second, the industrial capacity argument, that Russia can simply produce more missiles to replace the ones Ukraine destroys, is colliding with documented reality. The Institute for the Study of War, in its assessment published 3 days after the attack, noted that Russia's Kinzhal inventory has declined significantly from pre-war levels, and that production rates for the missile's specialized components, particularly its inertial guidance system, which requires precision manufacturing equipment subject to Western export controls, cannot fully replace combat expenditure. Russia is not fighting from an inexhaustible magazine. It is fighting from a magazine that is being drawn down faster than it is being refilled. Third, and most importantly, the attrition argument misses the most significant strategic consequence of what happened that night. The consequence is not the missiles destroyed. The consequence is the doctrine destroyed. Russia's entire infrastructure campaign was premised on the belief that a sufficient volume of simultaneous strikes would produce gaps, that quantity would eventually overwhelm quality. That night, Russia launched the largest volume it has ever launched, and quality won. Not barely, not on the margins, by an 86.2% margin that exceeded every prior performance benchmark. The doctrine does not work, and the Kremlin knows it. But the story of that night does not end with the intercept data, because what happened in its aftermath extends in directions that Russia's military planners had not modeled, across dimensions that reach far beyond the immediate theater of conflict. Inside the Kremlin's military planning apparatus, the morning after a strike of this magnitude would normally involve a damage assessment focused on what got through, how many targets were hit, how much power was disrupted, whether the psychological and physical impact achieved the intended strategic effect. That morning's assessment produced something different, because alongside the damage data, modest given the scale of the launch, the planners received a document they had not expected, a detailed technical analysis compiled by Russia's own Aerospace Intelligence Directorate from signals collected during the attack, of exactly how Ukraine's air defense systems had performed. The document, described and outlined by sources cited in a Financial Times investigation published 2 weeks after the attack, reached a conclusion that the planners found, in the words of one source, professionally difficult to read. Ukraine's intercept performance had improved, engagement by engagement, in real time during the attack itself. The Patriot operators, the IRIS-T crews, the NASAMS teams, they had adapted their intercept geometries based on what they observed in the first waves of incoming weapons, and improved their performance against subsequent waves. The air defense network had learned during the battle, not over weeks of after-action review, during the battle. This is what artificial intelligence-assisted targeting integration looks like in practice. And Russia does not have it. Now look at what the broader Western alliance took from that night. Because NATO's defense ministers and military commanders did not simply monitor the attack as observers. They studied it as a live laboratory for the most important question in 21st century warfare. Can integrated, networked, multi-layer air defense defeat mass saturation attacks? The answer Ukraine produced that night was the most comprehensive operational data set ever generated on that question under real combat conditions. And that data set is now being analyzed in detail at every major Western defense research institution. At the NATO Defense College in Rome, a working group convened within 48 hours to analyze the intercept performance data and produce implications for NATO's own air defense architecture. The preliminary findings, shared with member states in a restricted distribution document, concluded that Ukraine's model, multi-system integration, real-time networked targeting, continuous learning through operational feedback, represents the template for future NATO air defense investment. Germany, which has committed a second IRIS-T SLM battery to Ukraine and is accelerating procurement of 3 more for its own forces, announced immediately after the attack that its defense ministry was reviewing the specifications for the next IRIS-T contract to incorporate lessons learned from Ukrainian operational data. Poland, which has invested $2.5 billion in its Eastern Shield ground defense program, quietly approached the U.S. State Department about accelerating the delivery of additional Patriot batteries beyond those already under contract. Citing specifically the performance data from that night as justification, Finland and the Baltic states, which have spent 3 years restructuring their air defenses since joining or moving toward NATO membership, received the Ukrainian performance data through alliance channels and, according to Finnish defense ministry officials speaking to Helsinki's Ilta Sanomat newspaper, immediately initiated a review of their own integrated air defense architecture to align it more closely with the Ukrainian model. Russia launched 188 weapons to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure. What it actually produced was a live demonstration, broadcast to every NATO defense ministry simultaneously, of exactly how to defeat Russian air power doctrine. At scale, under pressure, with real lives on the line. But there is one final dimension to this story that is perhaps the most consequential of all, and it operates not in the military domain, but in the political one, and it reaches all the way back to Moscow. The Russian citizens who watched state television the morning after the attack were told one story. They were told that the strikes had been massively successful, that critical Ukrainian infrastructure had been destroyed, that Ukrainian air defenses had been overwhelmed, that the operation had achieved all its planned objectives. Every one of those statements was false. And an increasing number of Russian citizens have access to enough information to know that they are false. The Telegram channels that have become the primary source of unfiltered military information for millions of Russians, channels run by mill bloggers who are nationalist in sentiment but professionally honest about military outcomes because their credibility depends on it, told a different story. The channel Rybar, which has 1.2 million subscribers and is read extensively by Russian military officers, published an assessment of the attack that described the intercept rate with precision and drew the operational conclusion explicitly. At current trajectory, Russia's air campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure is achieving strategic costs that exceed strategic benefits. That assessment was not censored. It was not removed, because the Russian government calculates that nationalist mill blogger credibility is more valuable than suppressing unflattering operational analysis, and because suppressing it would simply confirm everything it said. The conversation happening inside Russia about that night's attack is not the conversation the Kremlin intended to generate. It is a conversation about why 86% of the largest strike in modern European warfare was shot out of the sky. And that conversation does not end well for a government that has told its population for 3 years that victory is inevitable and Ukraine's defenses are degraded and the collective West is exhausted. A senior European diplomat, speaking anonymously to The Guardian in the days after the attack, described the political dynamic inside the Russian leadership in terms I will carefully paraphrase. They launched everything they could justify launching in a single night. And it was not enough. The problem for them now is not tactical. It is what to tell themselves about what comes next. That is not the analysis of an enemy. That is the observation of someone who has spent years watching how authoritarian governments manage military failure. They manage it for as long as they can by calling it success, until the gap between the official narrative and the available evidence becomes too wide to bridge with any amount of state television airtime. Russia threw everything at Ukraine last night, and in the morning, Ukraine was still there. The lights were on in most of Kyiv, the water was running, the hospitals were operating, the air defense crews were rearming their batteries and filing their after-action reports. And 4 people in Darnitsia, Ola, Mykola, Darina, and Maxim, were not. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The extraordinary capability Ukraine demonstrated that night, and the irreplaceable cost of what got through. The miracle of the 86% and the grief of the 4. Let me take you back to where this story started. Those 17 simultaneous alerts cascading down Ukraine's air defense chain of command in the final minutes before midnight. The officers who saw those screens light up that night knew exactly what they were looking at. They had been trained for it, prepared for it, equipped for it, and in some cases had been waiting for it for years. What they had not known, in the months and years of preparation, was whether everything they had built and everything they had been given would be enough when the moment finally arrived. Now they know. Vladimir Putin launched the largest aerial attack in modern European warfare. He launched it against a nation he expected to have broken 2 years earlier. He launched it with every weapon system in his available inventory, at maximum scale, from every available vector. He launched it with the explicit strategic intention of finally producing the infrastructure collapse that smaller strikes had failed to achieve. Ukraine's air defense network, built from the contributions of 23 nations, operated by crews who learned their trade in actual combat, integrated by a command architecture that NATO's own engineers are now studying as a model, met that attack in the dark above Ukrainian cities and destroyed 162 of 188 weapons before they reached their targets. The world had never seen anything like it. Russia had never planned for anything like it. And the morning after, as Ukrainian engineers finished restoring power to the last of the affected substations, and Ukrainian commanders filed the most extraordinary air defense performance report in the history of modern warfare, the strategic calculation that had driven Russia's 3-year infrastructure campaign reached a conclusion that the Kremlin did not intend and cannot easily reverse. Russia threw everything. Ukraine caught most of it, and what could not be caught was buried. With full honors in Darnitsia, the world was shocked. Russia was silenced, and Ukraine was still standing. Thank you for watching. If this analysis helped you understand what actually happened in the skies above Ukraine that night, beyond the headlines and the official statements, please like this video and share it, because the truth of what is happening there deserves to be understood clearly by as many people as possible. At TGN, we will continue to follow this war with the attention and the precision it demands, because the people fighting it deserve nothing less.